Well, welcome to ATG, the podcast. Today I'm talking to David Worlock, who's one of the best-known figures in scholarly publishing with a career of more than 50 years, covering publishing, strategic consulting, and today commentating. So welcome, David. Very good to talk to you.
And good to be with you, Michael.
Thank you. So let's begin, as I think we must, with your early career, which is described so memorably in your book, Facing Up to Father. You described how you were brought up on a farm. So the obvious question is, why aren't you a farmer today?
Well, I think there are two answers to that. I think one of them is the answer I gave my father, which was that I did not wish to be a lavatory attendant to a cow for the rest of my life. He found this unsatisfying as an answer, and I, looking back, think it was very rude and presumptuous. And the real truth was that I didn't have the type of concentration which you needed for repetitive and routine jobs day after day, week after week, month after month. My mind craved variety, and my curiosity craved new things to be curious about. I certainly found those in the world of scholarly communication.
Well, that makes lots of sense. But after your experience at Cambridge, your first publishing role was with Thomas Nelson, and I can't believe it wasn't repetitive at the beginning.
Well, it was a little bit in the sense that I came in as the graduate trainee, but being the graduate trainee, I was passed from hand to hand around the company. And this month I would work in design. Next month I'd work in sales. The month after that I was in advertising. So it did have great initial variety, more routine when I settled into an editorial job publishing books for 11 to 18-year-olds, but a wonderful excitement as well, as I discovered that there was a real problem, that less able, as they were called, pupils didn't read books. So how to find a way of unlocking the learning abilities of those pupils, that became a quest for me and something of a crusade.
So after working for a textbook publisher, you then moved to Thomson Law Publishing. That must have been quite a contrast.
Well, it wasn't really any Thomson Law Publishing then. I mean, the lovely part of this is that Thomson were doing an acquisition, and by mistake left inside the purchase something called the European Law Centre. It had two journals, the European Human Rights Reports and the European Court of Justice Reports, and that was it. So what could we do with it? And that was the challenge. I'd spent over almost 10 years at Nelson. I'd moved from being graduate trainee to being group executive publisher. So I felt that was a fulfillment in some ways. And so what could I do with this tiny little outfit? There was a mad Welshman there who had a brilliant idea. He was a computer scientist. He was working as their technician. And he said, why don't we put all of this law stuff on a computer and search it? Well, that was radical. I loved that idea. In 1979, we sat down and put 450 million words of British law, all the statutes, all the case law, onto a computer and used a program from the Atomic Energy Commission to search it. And it was one of the very early commercial dial-up services before the world of online had quite emerged. But the content was there and the searchability was there. And we had great fun selling it to British lawyers and then to American lawyers. I made an alliance with a company called West Publishing in St. Paul, St. Paul, Minnesota, and that was wonderful. They didn't quite believe that in putting the full text up, they said you should only put the abstracts up. But we got on very well, and I sold my search software to a company called Cluer in the Netherlands, and they were starting to do the same thing. And here we all were, old-fashioned publishers moving slowly, cautiously, but inevitably into the digital world. It does seem that from 1979 to now, our progress has been not exactly rapid, but never mind. In some ways or another, we've got there.
So that perhaps explains the answers the next question I was going to ask, which is how you got involved with technology. I think you're something of a rarity for senior publishing figures who took a very early interest in applying technology to the publishing process. So is this where it came from?
No, not really interested in technology as such. What interests me, Michael, is change and the way change works. And, you know, after I left Thomson, they sold my company to what was then Reed Elsevier, who combined it with the American franchise later purchase that they had made of LexisNexis. After that had taken place, and I became an independent consultant and started a small consultancy company to talk to people about the digital world, I suddenly realized that the way change worked in publishing was surreptitious. I remember talking about the cloak of change. In other words, people would pretend that they were more digital than they were, and they are still doing it. So what happens is that at one time it becomes fashionable to make a change of a certain sort, and we saw it in the late 1990s, moving into the early 2000s, as most text publishers began to put text into databases and began to claim that they were in some way digital, when in fact what they had done was not change the format or the way in which content was held. They simply put books and articles into a digital appearance. Nothing else had changed, and I suppose that was inevitable. But I think only now in scholarly communications are we beginning at the beginning of the real effect of AI on what we're doing. Are we beginning to appreciate the totality of digital change? And so that has been the work of 30-odd years.
I couldn't agree more. I started my consulting career thinking I'd probably have 18 months at most advising publishers on the switch to digital, and I'm still talking about it today.
Quite so.
So in 1985, why did you move into consultancy from management and running publishers?
I had worked for, this is not a criticism of Thomson now. Thomson Reuters, but all big corporations. At the top of the corporation for which I worked were strong ideals, great drives. People were about improving society, making the world better. And then between them and me were layer after layer of managerial accountants who were all about control and risk aversion and returns and margins and all sorts of other good things, which had to happen. I'm not against, I'm not anti-capitalist, but I do believe that capitalism depends upon a sense of adventure and a sense of combating risk with well-judged decisions. Now, I was hugely frustrated when I left, and I thought I would start to work for somebody as cantankerous and unreasonable as the people I had been working for, only somebody I could understand better. That was me. And I decided I would never again work for third parties. And I've been extremely fortunate. I never have done. So from 1985 onwards, I was able to work for myself, first of all, in a company called EPS, which I started in 1985. And then after I sold it to Outsell Inc. In 2006, working as an independent consultant to them. And so that has been a huge pleasure. Incidentally, I have to say that Thomson Reuters gave me a leaving present. Well, actually, two of them I just felt rather guilty about my exit. One of them gave me a fortnight's holiday, he said, in Boston, or rather in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to do a course at the newly started Media Lab of MIT. The other one gave me 3 weeks of expenses to visit art centres in Umbria and Tuscany. That was also highly valuable. But during those 2 weeks in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1985, I went on this course run by Negroponte, then in his prime, in his pomp, and I attended a seminar which made a huge difference to me, by Professor Marvin Minsky, recognized now at long last, I think, as one of the founding figures of artificial intelligence. And he said something then which moved me strongly, not in the actual seminar itself, but in the Q&A. When a Harvard librarian sitting alongside me said to him, "You're anti-book, aren't you? You want to see the end of the world of books, Professor Minsky." And Minsky said, "No, I'm not anti-book at all. Simply this. I love books. I've been educated by books. I work and live in libraries. But I would just like the books to be able to talk to each other. I'd like them to be able to update each other. And I'd like them to be able to point out when they were out of date and subjects in them needed to be researched afresh." So, that seemed to me to be a signpost towards the future. And I've treasured it since 1985.
That's a wonderful comment that perhaps we can come back to when we talk about present day AI, which might be approaching that. But what I'd like to do is talk about a big topic, which is you've been involved with from the very start, and which is open access. You've said many things about. You're very quotable. You've said many things about open access, but one is that just recently, I think at the Fiesole retreat, you said the open access change has been less than fundamental. So what do you mean by that?
Right. Okay. My encounter with open access began in 2004. I had a commission from the UK Parliament, from the Science and Technology Committee, whose chairman, Ian Thomas, was a very straightforward, rather outspoken Labour MP for Ipswich, and he decided this open access thing had just begun to become a a big issue in the US, backed by a couple of Nobel Prize winners, and he decided there should be an inquiry. What's this going to do? So the inquiry had to have a chief researcher, and I got the job for 6 months of doing that, in the course of which I took evidence from people from all over the world, and indeed from the very largest players in scholarly communications in science publishing. So their conclusion was that if it was allowed to run untrammeled, it would wreck everything. Of course, the publishers thought this was a disaster. It had to be opposed in every way. The present system was the gold standard, and the publishers, held on to the peer review resource as the reason why they could not be removed from the system. And I felt by the end of the review that there was a possibility of fundamental change. In fact, I don't think fundamental change took place. I think we're now around 50% of published articles being open access, and I think what's happened is we've created a new form of publishing, a volume-based publishing, and it has huge dangers and has created real problems, and actually it signals a change in the type and style of publishing, which I'm very happy to talk about, which I think open access has enabled, but open access is probably now over. Pause for a moment. Here we are in a week when it appears that the Trump administration is going to push forward with open access and maintain the Biden administration policy. You may say this is an oddly controversial thing to say. I simply believe that what is going to happen is that there will be a replacement of the volume-based open access environment with all the risks it poses to scholarly integrity by a self-publishing regime which will be administered mostly by institutions. My colleague Toby Green said the other day in a UKSG debate, which we both took part in, he said, if institutions and laboratories and research bodies are so worried about integrity, why don't they publish under their own imprint? You know? Why doesn't somebody come out and say this is a Salk Institute article, or this is a Mayo Clinic article from research done on our premises? We vouch for it. We stand behind it. Why doesn't somebody come out and say this is a Cleveland Clinic article? Sorry, I'm using all American medical examples. I could say, why doesn't somebody come out and say this is a Cambridge University article published by the Cambridge University Press? University and its press standing behind it. Same with Oxford. So it's an interesting question to me. It does seem to me that institutions and individuals will become the publishers, helped by librarians, renting, leasing publishing software. We have, the successors of Scholar One as they begin to develop and improve in the marketplace. They can be used remotely. We have now gifted to the nation by Springer Nature some very good checking software to check to operate peer review checks. It is not beyond the wit of institutions to set up humans to check the peer review software, but we can use AI to very effectively, through semantic analysis and other ways, sort out what's good and what ain't. So I think, have you noticed, Michael, you and I, as users of systems and services online, have become our own secretaries, our own bank managers. I see no reason why academics will not become their own publishers.
I couldn't agree more, but I have to point out that when the research integrity issue blew up relatively recently in the last few years, the sort of increasing concern about research integrity, one thing I noticed to my dismay was all the interested parties almost sort of covering their backs. A scholarly society is saying, we haven't got the time or resources to check it, and libraries saying it's not our job. And you couldn't help feeling that there was a bit of buck passing going on to not take responsibility for improving the quality of research outputs.
Yes, maybe cheaper though in the long run for institutions to do this rather than pay the APCs. And the APCs are inflating. I look at the drift of systems and services and the way in which we behave online. And incidentally, an acquisition of Springer Nature's 2 years ago, which I was very, very keen on, curators, was created as a self-publishing software for medical research. And as you know, it has been very successful indeed. So open source the software may be as a rapid change factor as open accessing the content.
Absolutely. Going back to preprints, one I think potential area is that the preprint servers, which actually predate open access, it's interesting that as if the wheel has come full circle, they're now being seen as potentially the way to implement the kind of changes you describe, in that more and more checks are being added to the preprint cycle. And I'm sure you're familiar with this new publish, review, curate model, which is based starting with preprints.
Yes, indeed. And I think bringing preprints into the discussion is extremely important. And I think for many research scientists, publishing a preprint fully checked will be their ultimate goal. I don't think, I have to say this in case friends who work there are listening. I hope they are. But I have to say that things like Cell and Science and Nature will continue to run at the level that they run at, but they will be collections of the best. They will be a way of giving distinction to a piece of work. They will not be the way of first airing that piece of work. And I think the other thing about preprint servers, which we always fail to underline, is speed. Getting it there quickly is very, very, very important, and especially in some of the critical hard science areas, and in some of the life science areas. Getting it there quickly, getting into the body of knowledge as rapidly as you can becomes a way of joining the argument. And I think we forget at our peril that the publishing process is still lumberingly slow.
Absolutely, and I think you mentioned change before, and one of the things which I think you're well placed to comment on is you mentioned that the scholarly publishing industry is slow moving. So, what do you think actually makes change happen?
In scholarly publishing, what makes change happen is margins. That's not a cynical comment. I see that the very largest players are now extremely concerned to establish themselves as data collectors, data aggregators for the vertical marketplaces which depend upon science. So they're aggregating data for engineering, for pharma, for oil and gas exploration, for all the other areas which are vitally important. They'll go on doing that, and they will make good margins doing it. But the scholar to scholar market, I think, will change quite radically into a real scholar to scholar market served by vendors of services and software and data collection. And incidentally, we have to come surely rapidly now to an end to the divorcement of data from articles, experimental data from articles, given that publishers never thought it was their job or their priority to do anything with the data.
Absolutely, that's data repositories, and one of the lesser known points about the OSTP, the Nelson memo, that sort of is the recognition of the need to deposit data as well as articles, which I don't think has been noticed as much as it could.
Right.
You quoted that lovely Marvin Minsky statement that you want books should talk to each other and update each other, and surely we're just about achieving that with generative AI.
Yes, we are. But there are curiosities still to that, it seems to me. I think, in a way, the fact that we have launched since January 2023, led by OpenAI, we have launched AI on the world as a consumer blessing, and have sought a revenue base amongst individuals if they're using it for business or research or whatever they're using it for. But we have sought to get the individual to flash a credit card at it. That seems to me a sort of a dog leg. If we had come directly at the problems of scholars and researchers and sectors, we would have come via small-scale LLMs. We would probably have come through RAG applications almost immediately. It seems to me that we're now coming around to the things which are important. We've got a hugely generalized world in place, which depends upon vast amounts of data, expensively curated into, I almost said pirated. Well, I wonder why I said that. Or curated into huge LLMs. So we have that, but actually what we want are very pointed applications, which probably will be created from data sets which are very tightly controlled, and which have pointed access to web environments which update them and feed them and provide query points for them. So I think as always, change fascinates me, and I think we've come a long way round to get to the place where we're going.
It's fascinating.
As so often.
It's fascinating, but I'm sure what you say is true, but it's fascinating how it is that that generative AI was launched with such a fanfare without an awareness of how it could be applied in a specific context like scholarly publishing. Do you think there's is that a failure of the developers, or is that is there any way it could is there any way we could further that change?
No. I mean, I think AI from 1985, when I first encountered it, and probably long before that, had been coming along on its course under different disguises. I remember getting very interested in neural networks and in expert systems of one sort or another. So it's taken an awful long time to get round to indeed an awfully badly named thing. Artificial intelligence is a total misnomer, surely. For me, especially since the abbreviation AI, as a farmer's son, always meant artificial insemination. But it's taken me a long time to re-edit my own neural networks to get that one out of the system. There was a sort of inevitability that somebody would try a cloudburst effect, and OpenAI, to give them their credit, did that. I don't think that, should we say, I'm not sure that generative AI, when the historians get to it in another 30 years' time and look at it, I'm not sure they will say that's the revolution. They may trace a line through all the different pieces of workflow software which we have developed, and we are now beginning to join up, so that automated process in many of our contexts is taken for granted. After all, we have just had a conversation about people publishing for themselves, and that could not happen without automated workflow.
Let's talk a little bit about the library. The role of the library during your publishing career has transformed enormously from buying books to essentially licensing content. What do you think the role of the library should be today?
I think the librarian is the critical conductor of the information orchestra. The nexus, the point, the meeting point where everything comes together, and it is as you note, it's a system of inward as well as outward, or outward as well as inward process. The librarian is the officer chiefly responsible, I would have thought, for content acquisition and content disposition, content being radiated targeted to an outer world. So, yeah, absolutely critical role. And like publishers, it seems to me, librarians seem to see that in a very partial sort of way. I do indeed still meet librarians who say, oh no, I'm just about collections, or I'm just about... you referred to the Fiesole meeting. I was very, very impressed by a librarian there whose total work is about physical objects, not books at all, but items in collections, and their retention and information about them and their preservation. The librarian is also a fully digital in charge of a fully digital environment. And I think, that's critical. Will librarians change? I think they are changing. I think many of them have changed. And that conference was a very good example of that. But then again, there will be some who wish to cling to the ancient rights of the library.
You said memorably, librarians are sometimes strangers to the people we seem to serve. What?
Yeah. Well, yes, they have not always, I think, been the most consumer-orientated group. But that's, I think that is partly because we're all in a state of flux and change around the business of the digital interface, and beginning to understand how people work digitally and how people learn digitally is the slowest process in the whole thing of digital change. We can put people in front of screens, we can tell them that they're now digital, we can tell them all the content's digital, etc., etc., etc. I've recently been writing about education and learning with AI. And I'm going to publish some stuff on this later in the year, but I am very interested in the librarian as a teacher, a teacher who's able to assemble resource in such a way and in such an order and in such a tiered levels of difficulty that it creates learning journeys for library users, but also for the fellowship and scholarly community which the librarian serves. So the librarian becomes a polymath: teacher, resource provider, and publisher. Why not?
To that end, I was very impressed that both the Fiesley and UKSG conferences both included sessions on AI literacy, run by the library as a service for their students, but also for their researchers. Do you think that's a role the library should have?
Yeah, I do. I think they need to practice it before they teach it, but I think as do we all, perhaps. As do we all. I recently had a straight-up quarrel with a particular AI which I've been using for editing purposes. I'm now partially sighted, and I find AI editing excellent. But I do have to remind it that when I split an infinitive, it's going to stay split. Thank you very much. That was a deliberate act of flagrant ungrammatical behaviour, not an accident. So, and I don't want AI to remove style in favour of stylistic convention, but. I think seriously we all have to learn that. And I was delighted, like you, to see that those sessions were taking place.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned AI to some extent taking over, and this is also true of the kind of utilities you described for automatic checking and so on. And one of the areas which seems to show the limitations of this process is in the humanities. You're a humanities scholar yourself, and I'm sure you've noticed that so many of the innovations from AI are applied to science publishing, and in the hope that that humanities scholars might kind of catch up later. Do you think that's how it's going to work?
No, no, I don't. I think I think that we've labored too long under the pretense that there is something called academic publishing, when really there is humanities publishing and there is science publishing. I don't believe that these two will stay together in the same way. I think this idea of the journal, don't forget, the journal was created in this country and at around the same time in France by the then administrators of the Royal Society in this country, as a way in 1662 of beginning to record the experimental work which members were doing. And that was a science activity for science. But of course, nobody then would have called it science. It was simply knowledge. Now, you know, other things are totally different. I'm a historian by training and avocation. I don't think that the whole idea of the journal does really very much for history. The collected essays, the occasional paper, the lectures, those do huge amounts, and they must be connected and linked, and explored. And AI can be a useful tool for exploring them, but it will explore them differently and in different ways. From physics or chemistry or whatever.
So if we're abandoning the journal, do you think maybe we should look at abandoning the book? The monograph is sort of dear to the heart of most early career humanities scholars.
Well, yeah, abandon is the word I object to in that sentence, Michael. I really don't think we're abandoning anything. We're used to creating thinking and knowledge in chunks. Now, the book form, well, I read today by audio. Therefore, I'm acutely aware of how long is a book. The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon is 128 hours long. The Tale of Genji in 2 volumes is 33 and 39 hours long, respectively. An average novel is 8 hours long. In the modern of a modern novel, as far as I can see, most of the history books I read are about between 15 and 20 hours long, and we use the same word for all of those. Book, we call them. You know, in a digital world, we may call them albatross. I don't know. The word doesn't really seem to me to matter. The chunks of information, knowledge, content, whatever, are so different in type and style, and then we come to the interesting question of machine interoperability. One of the things which has to happen, and which we've been very slow with, we've been going on publishing things as if the primary first level readership is human beings with their eyes. This is no longer the case. It is almost certainly true that the majority of readers of scientific journals are machines. So why do we publish a research article as if it was a narrative, with an abstract at the front, and then here is the claim or the thesis being laid out. Now we move on to the methodology by which we're going to demonstrate this. There we've got the experimental results, and here's a literature review, and then we put in the citations, all this, and then here's our findings and conclusions. And this is a lovely narrative story. I can assure you that no machine reading that values the narrative values of it. So, why don't we mark the thing up so that the machine can operate with it easily? Because we're going to use it mostly by asking AI to go into it and synthesize it anyway. We are seldom going to read it in that long narrative form. And the same is going to be true of most pieces of knowledge. So whether you call it a book or an albatross doesn't really figure very much.
You mentioned margins earlier on as the sort of as the driver of change, and surely margins is the driver of change when it comes to the scholarly monograph, which looks as though it's been dying on its feet commercially for the last 20 years or more. So, do you think there is any future for the scholarly monograph?
Yes, I do. I think if it becomes a digital only self-published environment, then it becomes a very easy form of communication once again, and cheap to do, and because it's going to work straight from the screen of the originator, straight being typed directly into. Why do I keep saying typed? I regard the keyboard as one of the biggest dog legs in progress. Here we are back to communicating by voice. I, semi-sighted, can only write using my voice. I can't use a keyboard anymore. So this seems to me to be inevitable, that the lecture notes, the working hypotheses, the materials gathered in the memory of the desktop machine become again part of the deposit into the thinking body online of material in any particular subject area.
It will be lovely to continue. There's so much that you can that you've told us, and it's been fascinating listening to your insights. If we could just look back over your career, what are you most proud of in your 50+ years of scholarly communication?
Oh, I'm most proud of what I'm about to do. Always. The past is, I'm a historian, the past is the past. Other people will dig over that, thank you very much. No, I still have arguments to make and things to do, but I guess the thing which makes me happiest looking back is the people. at EPS, at Electronic Publishing Services, and subsequently, I have worked with a lot of people, mercifully, many of them much younger than myself. And if I've helped some of those young minds think critically about some of the issues, that would give me great pleasure, because that's what we do. I learnt, I pass on. That's the best thing we can do.
That's a lovely point to end. We're surrounded by machines, but the most valuable thing is passing on or helping people to realize themselves.
The more central the machines become, the more important the human-to-human interaction will become.
That's a lovely ending point. Well, thanks very much, David, for your time.
Thank you, Michael, very much indeed.